Welcome back to our follow-up in our keynotes. Our guest is Yassin Al Haj Saleh, that we are honored to host here. And he is actually our neighbor in Wedding. He's been living in Wedding for the last 3 years. And before his keynote, I would like to make a short introduction of him to you. Yassin Al Haj Saleh is one of Syria's most important intellectuals and political dissidents. And during the Syrian uprising, he was often named as the conscience of the revolution. As now the Syrian war reaching its decade, he has been also actively writing and thinking about the Syrian affairs since 2012. He left Syria in October in 2013, and he came here in Berlin. He's born in Raqqa in the beginning of the 60s, and he was incarcerated between 1980 and 1996 for being an opponent to the regime. Yassin is the author of 7 books in Arabic, mainly on the topics of Syria, incarceration, contemporary Islam, culture and intellectuals, Syrian revolution, and Islamic nihilism. He published also in French with the title Récit d'une Syrie oubliée in 2015 and La Question Syrienne in 2016, which was also published in English with the same name. He is a former fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin and currently has a scholarship from German Penn. And as I was saying also in my introduction, Yassin's critique of Western understanding of solidarity has been very formative for us in building the assembly. It was one of the really inspiring texts, especially. He is continuing on thinking about the need for a third movement of solidarity that would be a bit different from the 70s and the 80s and also 90s, which he also maybe we can say would like to name as with the solidarity with planetary dignity. I would like to welcome him on stage. Thank you, Yassin, for being with us and for making time. And we are looking forward to your session, Politicized and Depoliticized Solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Voland. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. And so I'll tackle the issue of solidarity. Maybe I'll try to problematize the concept by contextualizing it, putting it in the present global situation, and by differentiating between different historical formulation of solidarity and by politicizing it. This, I believe, will reinvigorate the concept of solidarity rather than compromises it, though, of course, it questions its clarity. For a way to give meaning to the present global critical situation, one may refer to Gramsci's conception of his time's crisis. In his notebooks on prison, he said the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. The new to be given birth to is, to my mind, a more democratic global society where humanity share gains, losses, and responsibilities for life on the planet. That's to think of humanity as a solidarity unit, which doesn't necessarily exclude subunits of solidarity here and there. and to develop a global conscience. This may sound hopelessly utopian, even irresponsible, given the fact that many societies seem to be unable to just keep going, let alone secure better life for themselves, for their members. But apart from the fact that the situations of different societies is growingly a function of international processes and relationships, the global society is already inscribed in our horizon today because of the inherently global character of the world problems: environmental degradation, pandemics, the Islamic question and issues related to the complex of terror, security, racism, among so many other problems. For instance, one can mention the problems that may come into existence because of the convergence of infotech and biotech, on which you know that Yuval Noah Harari built his fame on investigating the horizons of this convergence. The global attention to the American elections just a few days ago, the COVID-19 state of exception according to Gambin, and the widespread tense feeling after the recent terrorist crimes in France and Austria give us glimpses in a seemingly irreversible process of a global society formation. The global society is already there. What is not there yet is thinking of it as a solidarity unit with equal dignity and rights for all. Obviously, our world today is deeply divided, characterized by inherent and growing inequalities and generating much frustration and hatred. We are in crisis because we don't have a vision about how to proceed. Practically, we are in a TINA situation. TINA, as you may remember, there is no alternative, the principle that Margaret Thatcher said in 1980s, no alternative to the present capitalist liberal society. Our crisis today is one of loss of direction. We don't know where to go from here, so we just stick to where we are, or even turn to the good old days. But there are no solutions in the past of problems of the present, as much as there are no local solutions for global problems. To the morbid symptoms that Gramsci mentioned belong genocratic movements and tendencies. I'll explain now in a minute what I mean by genocratic movements. And tendencies growing presently everywhere, like right-wing populism in Europe, white supremacy in the US, Zionism plus, and Zionism actually. Zionism plus, I mean after 2018, after the basic law that decides that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, which means that the Palestinians are foreigners in their own land. Islamism in the Muslim parts of the world, Erdoganism in Turkey, Hindutva in India under Ravindra Modi, Putinism in Russia, and so on and so forth. Genocracy is sort of communitarian rule, whether the community is national, ethnic, racial, or religious. And I am here implicitly referring to the definition of genocide according to the UN Convention about the crime of genocide in 1948. So genocide, according to the definition, is to the destruction in whole or partly of a group defined as ethnic, religious, national, or racial. And actually, I think the advantage of the concept of genocracy is that in a way, it provides us with infrastructure of genocide. I mean, what's intimidating in the recent developments in these democratic movements is that the way is already open to genocides. And the most sinister quality of this sort of identity politics is that it could be the infrastructure of genocide. Moreover, genocracies display a responsible position towards environment based on traditional absolute sovereignty of states, which combines the threat of ecocide, murdering nature, destroying our ecological ecosphere, to that of genocide. Needless to say that genocracy is diametrically opposed to democracy, the constitutional rule of a changing political majority, while guaranteeing the rights of the minority or minorities. The image that might capture our critical situation today is passengers ship in the midst of the ocean, moving nowhere because of a problem in the engine. Let's suppose, for the sake of representation, that the ship cannot send messages to ask for help. With time, frictions abound in the ship, in the unmoving vessel, which grows smaller for movement, creates space, while remaining in the same place makes it even narrower, a prison. And this applies to my country, Syria. We've been not moving with no change, actually with war against the future, against change for half a century. In 3 days, it will be half a century of the Assad family rule in the country, and this turned Syria to a prison. Many Syrians call it greater jail. So we were in smaller jails, and after we were released from smaller jail, we just were released to a greater jail, greater cell. So the longer this crisis on the ship goes and the less provisions get, the more frustrated and selfish many passengers becomes. A likely leadership crisis aggravates the worsening situation. Those who call for solidarity and better organization for endurance and survival will not be heard, if not forced into silence. This is to say that solidarity is unlikely to survive a deteriorating crisis. Presently, it seems that solidarity itself is in a crisis, whether we understand it, solidarity, as a principle of social cohesion in changing society, à la Durkheim, in his sociology, or as a form of political activism in times of global crisis, as it is in the West since 1990s. Solidarity has little chance to be part of a solution after the genocratic turn, unless it is coupled to a vision of democratizing the emerging global society. At this juncture, it seems that what is mostly needed is awareness of the political nature of the world crisis today. The latter goes beyond what Habermas dubbed in a recent paper in the 13th anniversary of the German of unification in Germany. I guess it was just a month ago or something. So he dubbed the world turned more authoritarian and strife-torn. So it goes beyond this, in my opinion, to growing worldlessness, where we live close to each other but not together, where we don't share institutions, meanings, and responsibilities. This condition is no longer restricted to refugees. I mean, this condition of worldlessness, to refugees to which Hannah Arendt was referring when she coined the term after World War II. It tends to be a universal condition of a world based on sovereign states. This condition is already nurturing nihilism, militant and violent like the Islamist one, or not like the black nihilism held by Calvin Warren as political apostasy. I mean, it is sort of refusal of politics of hope that was held by Martin Luther King, for instance, that if we work better, if we learn better, if we organize better, we'll be equal someday. So black nihilism is based on refusal of this vision. Genocracy, worldliness, and the emergent global society are not in exclusionary relationship. I mean, I'm talking that we have already a global society, then I'm talking about worldliness and genocracy. I don't think the relation between them is, they exclude each other. They go together with the first two. I mean, genocracy and worldlessness being morbid symptoms of the birth of the latter, of the global society. To counterpoise this backward push towards genocracy, I believe that the principle of global responsibility is to be articulated as the basis for global regime change and a global society, better worlding the planet. The United Nations is dysfunctional more and more, and the oligarchy of the UN Security Council is leading us to less security and more division. International organizations function at best according to crisis management method, which does not care about issues of justice and politics, and the Middle East is one big example of this, where crisis management method has been practiced all the time, actually. Corporations don't care about environment. Sovereign states don't care about the world. Religions don't care about humanity. Intellectuals are less courageous today than they were 2 generations ago, but this is what it means, that we are in a global crisis. We are in a crisis because we already live in a global society while our international system is still referring to sovereign nation states. The priority in this situation goes to better, in my opinion, goes to better diagnosis of our global predicament, and certainly to developing better ways to deal with it as a method of mobilization and organization. Solidarity comes second. Allow me to give some examples of this prioritization. In the face of COVID-19 crisis, solidarity is a necessity rather than a virtue. Still, the priority is for an efficient health system and for developing a vaccine. Another example from my country, Syria, makes the point even clearer. Syrians have been expected to show national unity by a genocratic oligarchy that has been foreignizing most of them for decades, actually for half a century. This national unity talk has diminishing effect during 50 years of the ruling Syria through civil war, a rule that has narrowed the country more and more to the degree of explosion. Similarly, solidarity is not the solution of the present genocratic and worldless condition, though it could be a precious method for bringing together people who believe that we are passengers in the same ship, the only one we have. What justifies thinking of solidarity, of a solidarity crisis, is 2 problems one detects in practices of solidarity in Europe. They are characterized by a power relationship that takes solidarity away from equality, closer to patronage, and an oligarchic capitalist marketplace for causes which leaves it to the weak to compete for the rare support of solidarity suppliers in Europe. And this is based actually in my personal experience as a Syrian activist and writer. And I think I'm invited here because I wrote an article, a critic of solidarity, and the organizers read it. So I diagnose these two things, that there's a power relation of solidarity. Solidarity, the ideology of solidarity, solidarity is not ideology, but there is an ideology of solidarity that we are equals, we are, there's no power relation at all. Actually, I don't think this is the case, really, as far as I have seen things here. And I think there's a market for causes, marketplace for causes, and your chance to get, when you are a newcomer, your chance to get a share of the market is quite small, and the relation between causes and between bearers of causes is not a relation of solidarity. So it is also top-down relation. It is not horizontal relation, so to speak. So to better grasp the significance of this, was even more crucial in the fact that the seat of this depoliticized solidarity lies solely in the West, is the fact that the seat of the solidarity lies solely in the West. To better grasp the significance of this point, let's remember that between 1950s and 70s, the seat of solidarity was in the post-colonial world. You remember the three continents, the Afro-Asian solidarity, the three continents, peoples, and yeah. So it was, for a generation, it was there, and it was about struggling together against colonialism and imperialism. It was the time of non-alignment and Afro-Asian solidarity, or the three continents peoples. This form of international solidarity was oriented against the former colonial powers and imperialism in the capitalist West. In later stage, with the fall of communism and the victory of neoliberalism on the global scale, solidarity migrated to the West in the 1990s. This westward migration should be understood as one aspect of a broader migration following the end of the Cold War, and as a consolidation of the West-centered world after an interlude of decolonization, where history looked moving at that time away from the old continent. The solidarity migration to the West was one phase of the process that led to the emergence of post-migrant societies in the richer and the freer Western countries, and it was depoliticized the way immigration was and still is. What I was meant by depoliticized solidarity is that it is divorced from a vision of different world, and it is not a creator of new meanings of the world. Depoliticizing solidarity tends systematically to humanitarianize it, to think of severely warless people as humanitarian cases. And as a refugee myself and as a Syrian, I think this usually takes the form of denial of political agency. And patronage, of course, usually patronage as well. I'll not speak about denial of ethical agency, that we cannot decide what's good and what's bad, even for ourselves, let alone about the world, and denial of epistemological agency, that we can develop analysis about our country, our struggle, and even about the world. So it is even denial of political agency that we have a story, we have a struggle, and it is about justice, social justice, about freedom, about democracy. Integration policies in Europe. Integration policies are based not taking notice of the post-migrant process, leaving the door open to genocratic movements like AfD, rather than a real alternative for Deutschland. This genocratic party is born out of absence of real progressive alternative in post-migrant Germany. In France, the post-migrant society is facing even bigger challenges, as was shown by Macron's talk about Islam crisis and Islamic separatism, and then the reactions to the heinous crime of heinous killing of Samuel Bati, history teacher by a Muslim migrant of Chechenian origin. Presently, a widespread feeling of crisis is showing itself more and more, and one expects more initiative for affirmative action on the global level. COVID-19 just lent an edge of urgency to this feeling. A third solidarity, whose seat is global, is urgent now. I mean, the first solidarity was the Afro-Asian, the post-colonial, then the second is the new liberal after the fall of communism, and maybe it is time for a third solidarity. The seat of this third solidarity should be global, which entails efforts for a third, the efforts for this third solidarity should be based on less of the global situation and exploiting the still more convenient condition available in post-migrant societies in the West. While this is an inevitable starting point, dismantling Eurocentrism should never be left to disappear from our sight. All centrisms lead to worldlessness today, and by no means to world fullness. This is not a word we find in dictionaries, but it is a possible word. So to speak, or amour mundi, what Hannah Arendt called l'amour mundi, which means to care for the world. As you may see, I'm using worldliness in a different meaning. I mean, it is not just to name the condition of refugees or people out of any political community, like many refugees especially the Jews after the Second World War, and they were denied right to have rights because they were out of any political communities. I'm using the worldless as the condition of all of us under sovereign states, denying that we are in a world, we like it or not, there is a global society, and to struggle for this global society to be more democratic and to provide equal dignity and equal rights to people, to humans. So we need to decenter the world without sacrificing universalism, as many tend to do, thinking mistakenly that this is a way to resist Western imperialism. I mean, they sacrifice universalism on the altar of Western imperialism. And this includes the concept of human rights, which is really counterproductive. To say that maybe the Arabs have their own concept of human rights, the Chinese, the Indians, and this leads to far worse conditions than the ones we complain of because of imperialism. Universalism can and should take a form of global responsibility. On this basis, a new politicized solidarity can be different from depoliticized and worldless mode of solidarity we have seen in the last 3 decades. The Progressive International that was launched in May 2020 is an expression of this need of the third solidarity, so to speak, after the one in the time of decolonization and the one seated in the West in the last 3 decades. At the same time, it shows that the way of struggle for global society is not paved with roses. I have a personal story I hope we have time to tell part of it. I was invited to be on the board of this progressive international the relation. It was 100% a power relation. People who are superstars of self-appointed superstars of international left did this. So it is, I'm sorry, maybe there's a personal tone in what I'm just saying, but I don't think it is personal. It is. So it is related to what I was saying about power relation, and even among progressive democratic-minded people, there's still a lot of power relation, I'm sorry to say. So it seems that I have to skip some parts of my talk. Well, this, However, this tells us, the story tells us that even when we fully realize the global character of the world problem today, we may follow exclusivist, hierarchical, and undemocratic ways of communication and organization. We know that the Communist International was reduced to a tool in the hands of the Stalinist Russia for up to 1940s for a third solidarity to healthily live, unlike the third international counterpart, and possibly unlike the PI, the Progressive International. It should be a democratic space of diversity and debate. To conclude, the aim of politically conscious solidarity is to produce a we, one that does not necessarily exclude all other we's, but stands as a universal level of our self-perception, we, the living, and as a new conscience, a new level in our conscience, like our need to environmental conscience, and as a resistance to the othering machines. I mean, especially to the sovereign Cartesian ego, murdering nature and realizing his agent, because it is usually he, his agency in ecocide, and the sovereign states that tend systematically to be genocidal. There's no way out of solidarity crisis, out of the way out of this global crisis. Moving from worldlessness to worldfulness, or to caring for the world. Thank you. It's time.
For the questions. Thank you, Yassin, so much. So we have approximately 10 minutes for a conversation. I'm just also writing Eva, hopefully she's here. Okay. Perfect. So there are a lot of there are different overlaps, and also between your statement and Eva's statement in different ways, and which also maybe fits in the conversation that I would like to raise the question about the radical. Because while today, let's say in popular media, we see like the radical is often translated to fundamentalist positions, or even we say like kind of projected in the fundamentalist positions. There is also another radical that is out there that's combined with love and empathy and care. So I wondered, with with both of your positions, like
are kind of projected in the fundamentals.
how should we understand radical these days? Is it still a useful term for us? And I'm especially like asking this question because most often I observe that very similar to the market of causes that Yassin, you were mentioning, that there is like a kind of a competition of the trauma and pain among different groups, and this generally also blocks a lot of conversations and different possibilities of togetherness. And somehow also the political subjectivity is also understood as this reactionary position taking more than anything else in this trauma competition. So that's in this framework, that's how I would love you to hear from both of you how you think of the term radical and its use today.
Thank you. So
Okay.
I'm not sure who should start.
Okay. I would just like. Yeah. Eva, can you turn your stream off because it's echoing my voice when you're. Yeah. Thank you. No, just like the sound. Video is fine.
So should I start?
So maybe
Eva?
Eva, would you like to start or yes? Go ahead, please.
Okay, so Yassin, thank you so very much for your talk. I regret tremendously that I couldn't be there, and I also regret that we cannot all meet in person. This is a great disadvantage. Anyways, I like in your talk. I liked the geopolitical context, which was perhaps a bit less present than in what I was saying. But I believe this huge scale of internationalism has to be brought back. So I mentioned universality and universalism as a necessary notion that we have to come back to. And I believe this is something that we agree on, that we need to have a vision of universality. However, there have been also multiple revisions of political strategies and political subjectivity. So what for me is interesting, for instance, is that in today's anti-fascist mobilizations, we look at the mobilizations and we see that, for instance, all those women's mobilizations, like the International Women's Strike and the various women's demonstrations in Poland, in the US, in other countries, they are actually constituting quite a large anti-fascist mobilization. However, within the classical studies of anti-fascism, they are not perceived as such. So that's a big paradox, right? That we have the anti-fascist movement, of which the feminist mobilizations and queer, gay, lesbian mobilizations are constituting quite a large part. And somehow they escape the attention, I would say, of the researchers of anti-fascism. So I think that there are some shifts necessary to understand political agency in its diversity, in its heterogeneity. So as I mentioned, Antigone and Ismene, right? Very classical, two figures of femininity. One which is vocal, which is radical in this classical sense. But let's think about Ismene for a second. Isn't she radical in her support for Antigone? Can't we think of radicalism also in this sense of not being heroic, not being kind of blatant and very visible, etc. But can we imagine radicalism as being something quite passive, quite soft, maybe quite caring? Or let's think about, in Poland we have this amazing political leader, Lech Wałęsa, who later became quite a controversial figure, but back in 1980s, he was an amazing working class leader, you know, a guy who was electrician, basically very simple education, rural origins, somebody who wouldn't be seen as a leader. So there was him, and he was radical in this classical sense. And then we have his wife, who was always standing with him and organizing a lot of conspiracy, a lot of underground political work. And yet, almost nobody would call her a political activist, everybody would think of her as a wife of an activist. And in my terms, I would see Danuta Wałęsa, so the wife of Lech Wałęsa, as a political activist as well. First of all, because the care work she was capable of doing, regardless of all the police investigations, imprisonment, all these things, she was constantly the caregiver, the supporter, the mother of 8 children, actually, the partner, but also the coordinator of all kinds of underground support work, etc., etc. So I would suggest that, for instance, we have to maybe rethink our notions of radicality and say, okay, isn't a person who is doing care labor, affective labor, and who is even being all the time or most of the time at home caring for others, isn't she radical? So this is my intervention for now. Thank you so much for your talk, for the attention, and I mute myself now.
Super.
Well, I think that, let's differentiate between the level of analysis and the level of activism. On the level of analysis, I think we should bring radicalism and sort of analysis of global situation closer. So one cannot be radical without thinking globally and trying to understand the dynamics, the processes, the relationships that are making and interweaving our world today. On the level of practice, I like this idea of care, L'amour mondi that Hannah Arendt talked about, to care about the world, to be positive about the world. Especially as a Syrian, as a refugee, we tend to develop a victimhood narrative and to be, the rivalry or the competition or the clash of victimhoods, which is quite nasty in our region of the world. So recently, actually, I was working and talking about politics of meaning. That people who suffered a lot, and I base this on etymological relation in Arabic between suffering and meaning. Mu'anat, suffering, and ma'na, meaning. So I find this very interesting, and I think this is the politics I care for now, because it allows us to care for ourselves, the weak. And I liked what you said about the weak, Eva, to invest on our weakness and to build. Meaning is not a matter of ideas or representation. It is also what a society can be formed on, because meaning is something that we share with others. And besides, when we represent our suffering with meanings, in a way, this has a therapeutic impact on us, and it helps us leave our traumas behind. So it also, apart from helping us to be in a community, it helps us to have history. To have a past, not to be tied to, because the effect of trauma is that you are tied all the time to the time of your traumatizing experience. So through representation, through production of meanings, we have a history. We let go of our traumas. So I think, to come back to radicalism, it is, on that level of analysis, we have to think globally and to understand what's happening everywhere in the world, the dynamic of what's happening in the world, and on level of activism, to care about the world, to show this l'amour mondi that Hannah Arendt talked, especially to face for us in our part of the world and face nihilism. I mentioned in passing the Islamic question, and I think this is a very important thing, though it is not addressed as such. It is a global question. It is not a problem of Islam. Maybe this is not the right time to talk about it, but however, we have a global question on this level, and it is very important to develop this politics of meaning to face nihilism.
Yeah. Yes, actually, like it maybe also answers like the other question that I wanted to raise after the radical positioning is what kind of world we envision beyond identity politics, or like beyond like certain understanding of identity politics that is like kind of further polarized by different also regimes of sovereignty for their own use, you know, they create a very particular emotional environment and to use actually emotions and feelings in this provocative and manipulative way in order to create and in order to block actually like kind of a communication between different groups and different positions and different histories and also different traumas, I would say. Would you like to like add to that world vision? Maybe that can be also connected to the idea of universalism, because you were also like mentioning that we shouldn't give universalism to the altar of the imperialism. Maybe.
Yeah, what I find always reactionary about identity politics is that this tearing down what should the level that brings people together, to develop a conscience, to develop a level of consciousness that though we are different, we come from different backgrounds, we occupy different social and positions, still there's a level of conscience and consciousness that we need, that we should care for and we should invest a lot in. Identity politics is always dismantling this on all their forms, and I don't find progressive potential in this, which is actually prosperous in our part of the world as well. However, let's differentiate between caring of the identity of the weak.
Yes, this is different.
And
exactly. That's what I mean, the polarization.
In the long run, actually, I think identity will not help the weak a lot. Mm-hmm. It can be progressive for a short period. The problem, of course, when we should say goodbye to identity politics, whether we are talking about minorities, whether we are talking about gender identities, or whether we are talking about any identity politics. It is not the basis for equal rights and for equal dignity. For maybe the idea of equal rights is not always very progressive itself, but this is the vision I think that we need to mobilize more in the present situation of the world. I think Eva may have.
Yes, Eva, would you like to say also maybe the last words, because we will need to close also soon, as you see, like you have the 2 minutes, but it would be really lovely to have the last words from you.
Thank you so much, and I agree that the concept of rights also has to be redefined. There is a fantastic analysis of Seyla Benhabib, Turkish-American, I would say, scholar, although perhaps this is not exactly how she identifies, but this is how I see her on the global map. So basically this revisiting of the precarious others, of the vulnerable others, etc. That's one thing. So concept of right rights has to be restructured. But I believe also the concept of, I mean, what interests me is not exactly identity, but it's more strategies or political agency as we see it. And I think this has to be reconceptualized because we are prisoners, I think, of the heroic vision of agency. So whatever counts as political has to be universal in this, I would say, a bit old-fashioned sense of solely finding universality on the level of, on the conceptual level, on the rational level, while affective and practical, labor-connected forms of identification of the politics are excluded. So I would say that politics is about affect. I'm actually somehow fierce to or following Wilhelm Reich and then Deleuze and Guattari when they say that masses don't choose fascism, they desire fascism, right? So there is something on the level of subconscious, but also on the embodied desiring practice that has to be revisited. And also I think that universal care and we can imagine radical care, basically. And we not only can imagine it, we also see it or sometimes experience it while working together. So my thinking would be that perhaps the end of identity politics, as we know it, should happen, obviously, but we should maybe move towards the weakness as an element, as a strategic element of political agency, and then redefine politics as something that at least begins with a sense of weakness and deprivation, and which follows also the strategies that we have at hand, therefore also not only the rational public debate, for instance, but also the debate which is constructed within labor, within strike, within protest, on the street protests, etc., etc. So how to conceptualize those forms of action is actually, I think, a task for a good theory of solidarity and theory of politics more widely. Thank you very much.
In 30 seconds, Eva, does this mean feminizing politics?
I think the protest is already feminized, so we have to, I think it means opening theory for the existence of women and minorities. Yeah,
Definitely, yes. Thank you both so much for this rich conversation on also like Eva staying with us and joining the conversation with Yassin. We enjoyed so much as the members of the studio, I would say, and I hope our audience also enjoyed it as well. Thank you, and hope this conversation continues also on different environments and other levels as well.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Eva. Take good care.